Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And welcome to another session that I am certain is going to be both interesting and exciting as a cross regional collaboration and discussion. Unlike most countries, which have one, maybe two, but rarely more than three leaders, China has the built in advantage in its foreign relations of having a whole bunch of them because there are seven members of the Communist Party Politburo Standing Committee. There are another 18 members of the Politburo itself. And the fact is, before COVID came along, a lot of these people used to travel around the world. And when they traveled around the world, they would often announce headline economic deals, big headline investment pledges associated, for example, with China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. And they would smile and shake hands in front of popping cameras and scribbling journalists of every nationality. But the thing is, those kinds of eye-catching photo ops and headline investment pledges with presidents or prime ministers or ministers of other governments belie the fact that Chinese players do a lot of engagement outside national capitals. And it's that engagement that often reveals to us some of the more interesting ways in which the Chinese increasingly adapt to local contexts, wrestle with local realities, engage with local players, and develop more supple and I would say sophisticated ways of working around the world. So we often hear that the export of some putative China model is the basis for China's expansion of its global influence. But all over the world, from Ecuador and Chile in Latin America to Myanmar in Southeast Asia to Pakistan in South Asia, China is expanding its influence not by imposing its own ways, but by adapting to deeply embedded local ways. And when China assimilates local forms, norms, and practices, it often takes place far away from these photo ops, far from government buildings, and far from capital cities. In other words, places and contexts that reflect local character, local preferences, and the goals of local people and local institutions. So, what that means is that a more complete and comprehensive picture of China's influence and impact means that you have to get outside of national capitals. And that's what our panelists today have all explored in four very interesting and important Carnegie published papers. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment. And this is the second effort that we've made to pull scholars of China's impact together from across very disparate regions. This is, as some of you may know, part of a multi-year initiative that we call China Local Global. It's generously supported by the Ford Foundation, and it explores these adaptive dynamics in China's engagement in seven regions of the world, from Africa to the Pacific. And we've published some really extraordinary and very granular research, mostly generated by local scholars and voices who know how things are actually happening on the ground. Now, as I said at a first event that we did a few weeks ago, where that all takes us is to a more globally active and influential China. But it's a China that's becoming more influential through complex, nuanced, and above all, locally grounded approaches. And especially in the global South, my own view is that that diversity of Chinese experience really matters to understanding the role that the Chinese government, companies, and interest groups are playing today. Now, what we've done today is gather four authors of four of our studies from three quite different regions of the world. And that's so we can, once again, do something that I think is too rarely done, and that's to talk cross-regionally and comparatively. So you'll see on the screen, I have with me Cynthia Quilicone, who co-authored a fantastic paper on how Chinese players use divide and conquer strategies at the local level in Ecuador, why that actually backfired on them, and then what they have and haven't learned from that. Xue Gong, who's in the upper left of my screen, maybe somewhere else on yours, is joining us from Singapore. She authored a terrific paper on how one Chinese mining company engaged with a really wide range of local groups in Myanmar, including local activists, local NGOs, faith-based groups, and even the Burmese diaspora. Mohammed Tayyab Safdar explored Chinese local engagement in Pakistan, sometimes, unlike a lot of studies of Chinese engagement in Pakistan, far away from the capital, Islamabad, or the military capital, Rawalpindi, things that China's engaging with in the local media, in the energy sectors in particular. And finally, Francisco Ordinez, who looked at China's public health diplomacy in Chile with an eye to the role played by local government groups, businesses, particularly during the period of COVID, in addition to the national governments in Beijing and Santiago. So, team, welcome. Thanks for doing this from every time zone. I thought maybe we could start by having me ask each of you to just do a little round robin, and you give us the 3 to 4 top line conclusions from each of your papers. So to put that a little differently, what's the story you tell about how the Chinese in your study adapted rather than just imposed? But above all, talk about some of the ways in which Chinese players in the story that you tell reached beyond Quito, beyond Naypyidaw, beyond Pindi or Islamabad to do that. And Cynthia, I thought I'd start with you on Ecuador, because you have this really interesting, I think I describe it as a 3-level story at the core of your paper. And the story you tell is indeed one of Chinese adaptation by acting locally. But tell me if I'm characterizing this wrong, but it's ultimately one that's almost a divide and conquer story that has the Chinese players first leveraging Ecuadorians in Quito against Ecuadorians outside the national capital in local Amazonian communities. Then second, leveraging non-indigenous locals against indigenous locals. And then third, in one of the 2 mining cases, because you line up 2 cases side by side, leveraging some indigenous groups against other indigenous groups. And that's an interesting story because it reflects Chinese adaptation to local realities, but it ultimately backfires on them in one of the 2 case studies where there's no mining, while in the other case, the mining moves ahead, but at the cost of violence against local groups, which to me doesn't seem like a very stable foundation for a long-term investment. So you're telling a story about local politics, but in multiple ways in Ecuador that could also have some lessons beyond that country. So Cynthia, what are the kind of top-line conclusions from your story?
Thank you, Evan, and you have done a great summary of our paper. As you said, this is a co-author paper with Pablo Rodriguez, and we explore there Chinese companies' strategies in the mining sectors. But I want to start first explaining why we chose these 2 cases, because I think it's very important to know why these 2 cases they bring us some lessons about what Chinese companies should do and should not do. At the beginning, when we started looking at the first open cast large-scale mining company in Mirador, we thought firstly that would be, the most important case to analyze. But then when we started exploring what has happened in other areas, we decided that there was another case that was pretty similar, I would say, exactly with the same sort of conditions, and with a different outcome. And that's we chose to compare those 2 cases. In the case of Mirador, as you said, both cases are located in the Amazon. Both are copper mines, and both are run by the CRCC Tongguan Consortium, which is a Chinese consortium, through 2 different subsidiaries. But in the case of Mirador, I would say that the Chinese consortium was successful. in terms of overcoming local resistance. And in the case of San Carlos Pananza, the Chinese consortium was totally unsuccessful overcoming that resistance. So that was the puzzle that we tried to solve. Why those two projects that they look so similar in the same region with the same conditions, the same company, more or less the same tactics and strategies as you have mentioned before, they obtain two different outcomes. And it's a little bit the puzzle that we try to solve and to try to find out what makes the difference over there. So one of them, as you said, managed to overcome resistance and is now in the exploitation phase, which is the Mirador project. And the other one is still facing very important resistance. And the Mirador case is a very important case because it's the largest scale, the first largest scale metallic mining in Ecuador, which is sort of like a historical, a pretty important, I would say, investment for the Ecuadorian and for the Chinese sides. So how did they overcome resistance in the case of Mirador? At the beginning, the Ecuadorian national elites, they were very prone to, I would say, Chinese lobby in their national capital. As you were characterizing the story at the beginning, Chinese mining company, most of the times through the embassy and through different lobby tactics, they were able to establish a very close connection with the elites in Quito. So it's sort of like the first step in their strategy. But what happened in the Mirador case? The Mirador case is located in an area that has sort of like a divided population between indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities. So in that case, in the Mirador case, they were able to set, as you said before, divide and conquer strategies, buying lands in legal ways first and illegal ways in the second moment, I would say. And with the population that was really opposed towards the project, then rely again back to the national government, and they force them, they force displacements in order to start the exploitation of the mine. And what's the main difference with the San Carlos Pananza case? The San Carlos Pananza case, even though it's in pretty much a similar area, it is characterized by strong population of the Shuar communities, of the indigenous communities. So in that case, that made all the difference. Why? Why is that? Because the Shuar community was much more united and strong, opposed to the exploitation of the mine. And at that point, the Chinese company again went back to the national government. They repressed, many of the Chinese communities that they were not prone to move and to relocate in other areas in order to allow for the exploitation of the mine. And the different bond that the Shuar communities had with the land made all the difference. And so far, until now, the same Chinese consortium, they haven't been able to start the exploitation phase of the mine. I think that shows a very different, I would say, approach that is based on the differences in the communities in one region versus the other region. And the apparent, I would say, alliance between the Ecuadorian national government and the Chinese consortium has ended crashing, opposing trends towards those mining exploitation. And at the end of the day, I would say, resource extraction, and I would say the strong objective of the government of allowing resource extraction, and particularly mining extraction, has yielded documented violations of human rights in the local communities that I think are a very important situation to take into account, because the problem with one of the communities is still going on.
Can you, before I move on, can you say something about indigenous mobilization in Ecuador? I mean, the Chinese are not the only multinational miners in Ecuador, right? They're Canadian mining companies that have operated there. Is there something distinctive about, you mentioned the Shuar in one place, is there something distinctive about the way those communities mobilized vis-a-vis the Chinese compared to other multinational miners? And then on the flip side, the way the Chinese dealt with that indigenous mobilization. Just say something about the dynamics of indigenous communities and extractive projects.
Right. I would say that the most important difference between Canadian companies, which are the other important ones in Ecuador, and Chinese companies, is that Canadian companies have been much more prone to be involved with local communities, doing, corporate responsibility programs, do different, strategies in terms of involving with those communities. One thing that struck me, and I'm not sure whether we mentioned that in the paper, I think I found that afterwards, is that, for example, the Ecuacorriente company that is currently exploiting the mine in Mirador, they don't have a social corporate responsibility department, right? And at the same time, they don't have a communication department either. So they have run a couple of polls among local communities to sort of ponder how the local communities evaluate the presence of the company within the area. And at least half of the community, and we are talking about the successful case, right? Not the unsuccessful case. Right. Half of the community, they don't perceive the presence of the company within the region as a positive force. And I think that's because at the end of the day, the Chinese company resorted to national capitals and sort of play each other against between national capitals and indigenous communities. As you have said, in Ecuador, the indigenous populations, they have a long tradition of mobilizing and opposing, different types of policies. And you have, as probably most of you know, in 2019, there was a huge mobilization against the rise of the oil prices that the government sort of liberated. So yeah, the indigenous movement in Ecuador is really, really well organized and structured. So at the end of the day, in the paper, we argue that, the organization of a strong and undivided indigenous movement made all the difference within the outcomes of these two cases.
Right. So the Chinese did okay locally, but not when they were indigenous mobilization. Right?
Exactly.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So let me go to you. So your story, it's funny, you're also in the mining sector. Although it's also in the mining sector. It's mainly one company, right? Wanbao. And there were a lot of media headlines a few years ago about all this local mobilization against Chinese projects in Myanmar, right? There was a dam, right, a big hydro project that actually stopped because of local mobilization. But in your case, as I read the story, that Chinese company actually developed a much more supple understanding. You don't have the indigenous, element in the same way because these are Myanmarese communities, but a much more broad-ranging set of local outreach strategies, including even faith-based groups, which I thought was very striking. So talk about that and what made Wanbao so different or able to do that as successfully as they did. And how much did political dynamics in Myanmar matter to that story?
Well, thank you very much for the questions. And I think you are rightly pointing out that Wanbao is a very special case in terms of China's energy or resource companies investing overseas, and in particular in the context of Myanmar, situation. My paper basically starts from what Evan just shared about the criticisms of Chinese projects. But Le Breton, at that point, you can say it is like in parallel with the Mison Dam that has evoked a large scale of national protests and demonstrations. And these activists were basically based on the accusation against Chinese, projects that violated human rights, forced resettlement, serious environmental social issues, and transparency issues. And like similar accusations like that. Like my article finds, one of the particular trigger that prompted the Chinese company to make a change is the democratic opening that gave the space of the local community or the local civil society, to let out their resentment, for the past decades under the military regime. And at that point, because of the support by the local institutions and don't have any doubts that was supported actually by the military government, that we have to rethink about whether these projects were first of all whether they were socially accepted, and second, whether they're viable for the local community. So the local institutional structure this pressure to the Chinese company, that's for sure. But on the other hand, I think what the Chinese company Wanbao has learned, that it's not a panacea, just to rely on the local institution. They learn the lessons that the local civil society plays a very important, very important part. And in some of the circumstances, they even determine where the project is gonna go. So because of the suspension of the project, Le Breton copper mining by the military government under that sign, very unilaterally, the Chinese company, they started to respond to the local demands. For example, whether they could be able to offer a complete and transparent social impact assessment report, whether they can come up with a socially acceptable, compensation and resettlement plan, and whether they have a sustainable plan for the well-being of the villagers affected. So there are a few steps that I think is very striking for Wanbao. And some of the Chinese scholars, they even argue Wanbao sort of set an example, or played a pioneering role, for their peers, for the Chinese SOE companies in Myanmar. So first thing they did is actually they listened to what the investigation committee, led by the former leader Aung San Suu Kyi. They followed the suggestion by this committee that they are gonna reduce their shares in the project from 49% to 30%, and they also agreed to reform their corporate institutions to improve on the issues that I mentioned about. And an interesting thing is they basically didn't rely on the previous environmental social impact assessment conducted by the Canadian company. They actually recontracted this assessment report to a third party, Knight Pisote, an international consultancy company that specialized in energy resource extraction projects. And the second is, to respond to the very, very critical local demands for compensation and resettlement plan, and to show, Wanbao is a responsible investor. This Chinese company, they conducted a series of corporate social responsibility activities. For example, not only just follow what the committee suggested, like by contributing 2% of the profit from the project to the community, they also come up with this yearly budget of $1 million fund to support the local resettlement and education plan. And also taking the cues from the local community that some villagers, they may not be suitable for employment due to different reasons. Wanbao supported this kind of local demands by setting up the young unemployment subsidy program, and also through supporting the local SMEs and the supply chains try to create the more job opportunities for the villagers affected. And the next step, I think, in my mind, is more striking, because Wanba has done something that is not very common in the Chinese SOE's overseas engagement, which is to take the initiative to get used to the social and cultural norms, especially in terms of the religious activities that they are not supposed to do. I'm not saying in Myanmar, where Buddhism is a national belief. I'm not saying the Chinese SOEs, their managers, they're trying to convert to the believers. What I'm trying to say here is that they invested their staff, especially the Chinese staff, to get to know why the religion is so important in the political, social, and economic life here in Myanmar. And they also, incorporated religious activities by the local employees of Myanmar. And somehow they invited, in many of the important occasions or events, they invited the masters from the monastery, to show their respect of the local practices, and also different from the narratives that the Chinese companies were very difficult to reach out. They're mysterious, and they are very ignorant, or they are very concerned of speaking from the media. What about actually, in this case, took several initiatives to receive interviews from influential media, for example, the local ones like Irrawaddy, Mitsima, and more surprisingly, they were reported to take the journalists around from the Economist magazine, to inspect their mining site. Although their parent company said, they reach out to the international media outlets such as BBC and VOA, I couldn't find out that such information. Probably they didn't really release it that, or they try to reach out in other different platforms. But these gestures basically indicate that the Chinese companies, they can be very adaptive to the local norms or local demands in terms of to show to improve their profile by presenting themselves as someone who is willing to engage in the local society. And one last message that I want to convey to the audience is that, according to the parent company of Wanbao, Norinco, this Chinese company was reported to reach out to the opposition party at that time, which is the National League for Democracy, and the 88 generation students group, which is a student-led pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, founded in 1988, but ousted by the military government. I mean, given the Chinese company's very sensitivity to to their the consequences of their engagement with these political figures, it can be very, very phenomena, to see that Wanbao, in order to protect their project, in order to protect their interests, they can be very accommodative to what the local society and the local institutions have been asking them for.
So both you and Cynthia referred to corporate social responsibility. And that's a term that's so associated with, American, European, multinational companies. Does Chinese corporate social responsibility in Myanmar look anything like, let's say, ExxonMobil corporate social responsibility, or you're in mining, Freeport-McMoRan corporate social responsibility? Or is there something distinctively Chinese or distinctively adaptive about the way they do it?
Well, I have to say, there are definitely different dimensions. Generally speaking, the Chinese CSR, most of them, I'm not talking about the case that I wrote for Carnegie. What I'm talking about in general sense is that the Chinese corporate social responsibility, they largely concentrate still on the philanthropic activities, and they pretty much pay attention to, soft infrastructure such as education, building a hospital, school, those and for example, bridge over there, but not really much in terms of whether how to improve the awareness of the governance of the local agencies, or how to improve the awareness of sustainability or environmental protection in the local society. So I would like to say they're different, but in Wanbao's case, I can see a bit of mix there. While I highlighted the donations, of course, and the yearly budget on supporting the community development project, of course, but also you can see they try to bring in some sustainable ideas, like how to use the waste from the mining site to recycle into to put it into use for the chicken farm opened by the Chinese company. They're starting to thinking about a much subtle but also a much more popular and more sustainable approach that catering to the demands of the local societies. But back to the point again of how different or how distinctive the Chinese and Western CSR is, I think the fundamental issue is whether the companies from both sides, they really look into the standard. For example, the OECD has set up, like whether they conduct a free prior consent, that kind of preliminary study before the project. Basically, from what I know is it's sensitive in a sense that some of the issues like labor rights issue, I don't think the Chinese companies, regardless they're private or SOEs, I don't think they are willing to touch that unless they are forced to. But it's very they're not good at this, so they'd rather to build something that is tangible for the local community, that is measurable, than getting to the trouble that may actually irritate the local agencies.
Right. Thanks. So, Tayeb, I love your paper. I love your paper first because it's a good paper, but I also love it because it's Pakistan. Because of all the places around the world where Chinese firms operate, China has relationships, particularly commercial relationships. That is the one that everybody only talks about national governments, right? There's a headline economic initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There are these slogans, right? The relationship is higher than the highest mountains. It's sweeter than the sweetest honey. The leaders are always getting together and the flashbulbs are popping. But you've got this paper where you tell this completely upside down story, and it's about local media engagement, including in the Urdu language or in other languages, or the energy sector, which I take it is a little more decentralized in Pakistan than many people understand. So take us to the Pakistan story and turn the story inside out a little bit on China's engagement there.
Thank you very much, Evan. Thank you for giving me the chance. The previous two speakers were wonderful. I think thought that it's very interesting how this sort of plays out in different parts of the world. So as Evan highlighted, my paper actually looks at three particular sectors within which Chinese actors interact with Pakistanis and how they adapt to Pakistani conditions. One is, of course, media, the energy sector, and last but not the least is education. Now, one of the things that, Evan, you pointed out is that the lens which is used to look at Pakistan and the Pakistan-China relationship in the popular media, as well as in much of the academic literature, is very strategic. And I think the danger with that sort of strategic lens is that there's much that's happening below the surface, which then does not get highlighted. And I think that's where my paper sort of adds value, and that's what my paper wanted to, or that's what I wanted to sort of highlight in terms of looking at these diverse, different sectors in which Pakistani and Chinese actors, sort of interact. So one of the things that Gong mentioned, which I think was extremely important, is the adaptation by Chinese firms to local customs and to the local political economy, as I would want to call it. So large Chinese enterprises like TCL, like China Machinery Engineering Corporation, they are not only putting boots on the ground, but they're also ensuring that their executives actually learn about local customs and local practices by getting education within Pakistani universities as well. So one of the examples is the Lahore University of Management Sciences, which is the premier university in the country. you have Chinese executives who are now going to these executive MBA programs in order to learn not only about local business practices, but also to understand how to be more sensitive to local sensibilities as they expand their presence within Pakistan as well. So despite the fact that Pakistan and China have been such close strategic allies for the last, or strategic partners for the last 5 odd decades, the broader sort of relationship that emerges over the last 10 odd years was missing. So the understanding about each other's country and about each other's culture was largely missing from the story of Pakistan and China interacting over the last 5 or 6 odd decades that they've been close strategic partners. So now with the announcement of the headline economic corridor, and even before that, we find that this sort of relationship between the two countries, as you aptly put it in the introduction, is moving beyond the national border. And that means that you need to understand local sensibilities across different parts of the economy. So education, I've told you how Chinese firms are adapting. They're sending their executives to learn about Pakistani culture. There's an executive center which once again is operating in Lums, which sort of is there to help Chinese firms understand the local business environment and for them to understand how local customs actually work. Now, then we go towards the media sector. In the media sector, we find that there is a push from the Chinese. So there's a definite push factor at play to understand or to get the Chinese message across. But on the Pakistani side, for the media firms, there's no coercion as such by the government to actually, work with Xinhua or work with other Chinese actors like, China Daily. There's an explicit economic rationale for media houses which are private to work with Chinese actors. And in order to make the message more palatable or more available across different parts of Pakistan, one of the ways that they're doing it very subtly is by translating things into Urdu, which although is, as Pakistan's a very diverse place, is not the the mother tongue of a large portion of the population, but it's still widely understood, right? So in order to get the message across to different different portions of the population, which is much beyond the elite, the idea is to engage with the local media and to get the message across of the Chinese state or the Chinese organizations. The third sector which I look at is of course the power sector. Now over here, the adaptation of Chinese firms is very, very interesting, because again, most of the literature that we've looked at in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative is this sort of focus of how Chinese firms want to do it alone rather than to work with local partners. There's this focus within both the popular literature as well as the academic literature to highlight how Chinese firms want to work alone within these diverse countries, within these diverse settings. In the case of Pakistan, what we see is that the Chinese firms that are state-owned enterprises actually have developed relationships with Pakistani conglomerates across different parts of the country. So across different projects, we see that there is a partnership which is developing between these large Pakistani conglomerates and the Chinese state-owned enterprises. So the question then becomes that if the Chinese have the capital, if they have the technology, if they have the human resource, why would they want to work with these Pakistani conglomerates? And I think that's where the adaptation picture story becomes clearer, because Pakistan's a difficult business environment to work in. Pakistani conglomerates have been operating in this difficult business environment for the last 3 to 4 decades. They understand how, once again, the local political economy and the local power structures work. So if the Chinese state-owned enterprises, with the backing of the Chinese state, enter into this country, they still do not understand how local conditions work. Who are the local power brokers? Who are the what are the levers that need to be pulled to actually get things working. And that's where local conglomerates have an advantage, because they understand how the local power structure works, they understand how to get things sorted, and they understand how to get things pushed along in order for these projects to work. So, just to summarize, in all of these three particular cases, we find that the Chinese actors are open to trying to understand what is it that's driving this interest, A, and B, they're also trying to, sort of understand how they can plug into these systems. So there's a definite push factor once again at work as far as these diverse Chinese actors are concerned, but they're trying to plug into the pull that's being generated in a place like Pakistan, which is once again not the easiest place to work in terms of the political as well as the business environment.
Yeah. So, Francisco, that's actually a good entry point for you, because speaking of conglomerates, since Tayyab talked about conglomerates, you've got this story about, it's basically public health deployment, right? Especially during COVID, masks, PPE, personal protective equipment, even vaccines. And, everybody talks about China's mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy. But in your paper, you've got all these local actors, including businesses and conglomerates, Chinese and Chilean, that are doing a lot of the sourcing, they're doing the distribution. Those are the points of connection. Is that different than the way Tayyab's telling the story in Pakistan, or is there something that's unique?
Well, I think there are lots of similarities. That's why the Pakistani case is so interesting. But when the pandemic started, Chinese donations were appearing in the newspapers, and it became very evident to me and other researchers that it was very hard to track them, because they were coming from very different sorts of actors. As you said, Chinese state-owned enterprises, Chinese privately owned enterprises, foundations, universities, city governments, provincial governments. So we started to track them in a very granular way. And what we found out eventually is that indeed companies from China played a major role, but this was mostly a demand side story. So Chile demanded Chinese aid, and they managed to leverage pre-existing business bonds. So that for me was also surprising. I learned a lot from writing this article, because Chile, which is a pretty small country in Latin America compared to, let's say, Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, was the third largest recipient of Chinese medical assistance in the first year of the pandemic. And that was mainly due to the demand side. By late 2019, you may know Chile was facing social unrest. We call it estallido social. And the government saw in the pandemic a way of improving its reputation. So to do so, they really thought of Chinese actors as partners in terms of companies, foundations, and perhaps the Chinese government sometimes helping bring very needed goods, masks, ventilators, COVID tests, and so on. And nowadays in 2022, of course, vaccines. You may know 75% more or less of the vaccines that are being applied in Chile are from Chinese labs. So there are a couple of very insightful examples of how non-state actors and also actors not located in Santiago played a key role. For instance, wineries. There's this Changi Winery, a state-owned firm, which is based in eastern Shandong province in China, which acquired a few years ago a large winery in Chile called Indomita, which is in Valparaiso. They were part of the donations that were made to the Chilean embassy in China. Another good example is Tianqi Lithium, which is it's been very much in the newspapers and discussed recently. They acquired almost 24% stake in Chile's largest lithium company, SQM for a little bit more of $4 billion. Was a major investment, and they are located up north in Salar del Carmen, close from Antofagasta. They also made a donation. And there's another side to the story which is very interesting, which is in terms of this local dynamic and decentralized dynamic, which is that Chile, when received donations from Chinese actors, also distributed them along the. So Chile has an unusual shape. It extends 2,600 miles north to south, but only 110 miles east to west. So it has a very interesting system of distributing goods through a couple of agencies. One of them is the National Emergency Office of the Ministry of the Interior and Public Security, because Chile is a country which suffers frequently from earthquakes. So by using that pre-existing structure, all those logistics, it is true that donations were gathered in Santiago from different Chinese sources, but eventually were distributed to where they were needed. So sometimes donations from Chinese companies were very much submitted to places where they were very visible. Despite being small or quite small donations, they made quite a large impact in small communities because they were very visible, and they made a large difference. So it's a very interesting story to me on how Chinese corporations, Chinese state-owned enterprises, and Chinese privately owned enterprises behave besides the businesses. I mean, they were functional to the interest of aiding and supplying to the mask diplomacy policy, but at the same time, they were pursuing the improvement of the link that they still have and they had before the pandemic with local business people. And it was very interesting to me to find out how strong these business bonds were. And indeed, Chile is nowadays one of the main receivers of Chinese investments in the whole region. And China is the main trade partner of Chile. So the economic story was a main driver for these local dynamics.
Do you guys, let me ask you all something. Do you guys feel like, and anybody should jump in on this, but I'm mainly looking at Gong and Taib on this one. Do you feel like Chinese actors operating in extremely diverse countries, ethnically, geographically, culturally, vary their strategies sufficiently to reflect that diversity? So, Taib, you said Pakistan is a very diverse country. Right. So Balochistan is nothing really like Punjab, which is really not exactly like Sindh, which is definitely not like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So, but Chinese firms are operating all over the country. So I'm curious how much variance you see cross-regionally. And Gong, same thing. Shan State is nothing like, Lower Burma, Upper Burma. It's just very different. How much variance do you see, either particularly among Chinese players that operate in different regions within a country? And how much learning do you think there's been over time? Maybe you want to start.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Evan. Because it's such a diverse place, I think learning to work in these diverse conditions is very difficult for different. But the kind of firms, I think there's a certain level of decentralization in the way in which many of these firms, sort of work on the ground as well. So the way that the CCCC, for example, the China Construction Communication Corporation, would work in Punjab would be different as compared to the way that they would work or they would operate in Balochistan as well, because of course Balochistan has its own unique characteristics as far as the security situation is concerned, as far as the sort of response of the local administration is concerned. So the way that they would operate across different parts of Pakistan would be very different in terms of the way in which that particular place is a part of the Pakistani state. If I don't know if that makes sense, but the incorporation of of these places within the structure of Pakistan is very different, and the actors who operate on the ground or the relative power that they enjoy is very different in these different places. So in Balochistan, for example, the way that decision making would work would be very, very sensitive to the sensibilities of the Pakistani state. You mentioned Islamabad and Pindi, so they would be very sensitive to that. But there would also be, and there has also been, this is not in the paper, but in the case of Gawada, for example, one can see how the Chinese firms that are working over there, including the port operator, China Overseas Port Holding Corporation, they're much more into doing some of the things that Gong mentioned, for example, building hospitals, contributing towards skill upgradation in this particular part of the country, because they want to be seen as a partner in progress of Balochistan, rather than being seen as they portrayed often as contributing to resource exploitation in this particular part of Pakistan. In the case of the firm operating in, for example, Punjab, corporate social responsibility would be a part of it, but it would be less, important or less of a lesser degree as compared to the incorporation in Balochistan. And similarly, we can see these sort of differences play out in the media, as well as in the education sector that I've talked about as well. So there are most definitely subtle and not so subtle differences in the way that Chinese state-owned enterprises work in these different parts of the world. And as I've said, most of these are driven by the local dynamics in terms of the relationship of that particular part of the country with the core, which is, of course, Islamabad and Pindi.
Yeah. So, Gong, I mean, your paper is on one company operating on one project in one sector in one place in Myanmar. But I know you've looked at other companies and other projects in the country. So maybe answer it not just through the lens of your paper, but a broader cut at how you see Chinese players operating in Myanmar.
Well, I would rather say, at least in Myanmar case, I don't really see much, domestic regional diversity there, because most of the, infrastructure projects that the Chinese companies signed is actually the Myanmar state-backed projects, which, to be more precisely, most of them, they are military government or military government affiliated projects. So that's quite, in a sense, it's quite stable, and it's very uniform. Unlike what you probably try to imply, whether the Chinese companies, they're gonna cooperate with the armed ethnic groups. As far as I know, all of those state-backed projects by the Chinese government, they have much less to do with that in that regard. So to answer your question, I think the diversity really here is how the local societal and institutional, interactions that could bring the diversity in, because in my case, I think it's also representative, or it can generalize in other Chinese companies during different phases. When it's phase one, for example, between Chinese company and the military government, they found it very comfortable of relying on the military government, because they at that time military government was isolated, and the Chinese companies can take full advantage of that, right? But after Myanmar government decided to do this opening up, and we found out the Chinese companies, they were awakened to the fact that, okay, there's the other bottom-up forces that we have been ignoring for so long, and cooperating with Myanmar military government is becoming a baggage or a burden for us. So we need to make some changes. And later on, when the civilian government came into power, again, there's a threat that the Chinese company actually still relies on the local institution. It's just the change of the regime, right? But because of the pressure from the much more democratic civilian government, the Chinese companies appear to be more responsive to what the local demands are. But look at what is happening now. When the coup d'etat, occurred last year, the Chinese companies retreated back to kind of like backward phase again, due to the concerns that they feel it's better not to play this high-profile picture in this uncertainty. So my point here is there is diversity, but not really in a geographic sense, but rather in a institutional and local or the public accountability level sense. So that's my 2 cents here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cynthia, what's the number one strategy that worked for locals in Ecuador generally, or in particular places in Ecuador, in terms of shaping Chinese response?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, one of the main problems that the locals found is that the Ecuadorian government didn't have much leverage against Chinese companies or Chinese negotiations, because during the Correa administration, China was given Ecuador so many loans that they were attached to oil sellers in the future, to oil sales in the future. So there was a strong, I would say, alliance between the national governments that they own so much money to China, and those Chinese sort of like lobby strategies. In terms of so I think that in that sense, the government and also the local communities, they have less bargaining power in terms of negotiating with China. And I think that makes a difference with the rest of the cases that we have been discussing here. I think that's a point that we don't mention in the paper, but I think that might have played a big difference in that sense. And in terms of the strategies that the local use, I would say resorting to indigenous organizations mobilization. That was one of the main strategies that they have used. As we mentioned in the paper, in some cases that was successful. In the other cases, it was not much successful. And the other thing that the Chinese tried to do is they tried to co-opt those organizations in some sense, and they try to co-opt the leaders, bribing them in some of the cases, right? So that depends on the cohesion of the organization in terms of facing those, I would say, incentives in a certain way to oppose mining exploitation in those areas. But as I mentioned before, the strong, at least 50% of the population in San Carlos Pananza is indigenous, and that makes a really big difference in terms of the strengths of the organizations over there.
So for all of you, a lot of the Chinese players that you're studying are actually multinational, right? They're not just operating in your countries of study. So one question is whether even though they're locally oriented, whether they're bringing lessons that they learned in one geography into a different geography. So there's an audience question from Benjamin Kreutzfeld, who's in the audience, and he's basically asking this question. He says, when you observe kind of a Chinese multinational operating in Myanmar or operating in Chile, do you get a sense that they're importing strategies and tactics that they learned from their operations in, you name it, Indonesia, Cambodia, somewhere? And he gives a very specific example. He says there's a Chinese oil executive that he met in Peru that had previously worked in Angola, right? Completely different geography, and now is heading the Indonesian operations for this company. So yes, they're locally oriented because Peru is not like Angola, not like Indonesia, but have you detected that some of the strategies that have worked in very disparate geographies are being brought by the Chinese players into the countries? And that's not adaptation to local conditions, but it's what you learn from adapting to local conditions in one place that changes the way you do local engagement generally. Have any of you seen that? Maybe not. Okay, go.
Well, absolutely. This local adaptation is not just pinned to a particular it's not as a particular strategy. It definitely it fits into the whole philosophy of Chinese way of doing things, feeling the stone when crossing the river, right? So, for example, in Myanmar, you're sensing, the local civil society now, or public accountability was much more valued, in the civilian government. But on the other hand, in other Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, right, the public accountability level is high, but still they feel, the Malaysian government has much more capacity, to handle with the issues on the ground. So why they have to bother with, I'm not saying they don't pay attention to, but why they have to pay special heed to those tricky and very challenging, public demands. And of course, it really depends on the local domestic, political economy, whether there were, large amount of overseas Chinese, whether, they have similar, cultural dynamics in that particular context. So I would like to say, for the Chinese, they don't have a very specific standard in terms of how to engage with the local. They are very flexible, and that's one of the reasons why they have been successful in terms of, winning the projects, in terms of collaborating with the local partners.
Francisco, or anybody else want to jump on that?
Yeah, I was thinking on the story here in Chile. Sinovac is building a huge plant to manufacture vaccines, COVID vaccines that will be sold all around South America. And Sinovac also approached or thought of South Africa as an alternative place. I think those are still under negotiation. The plant in Chile is being actually built. And it's very interesting that executives from the company engaged in a partnership with a university, with a Catholic university here. And through the partnership, they approached the Chilean government. And that was very much a learning process, which involved learning about very sophisticated health regulations and local regulations. And I was speaking to someone who has followed this process closely. And indeed, I mean, it's an interplay between local learning, but also trying to use the learning process. I'm sure the learning process from Chile will be useful in the future if they decide to set up a similar factory in South Africa. So I've seen that a lot in terms of Chinese investments in the region in the last 10 years. It's been certainly a learning process in which there's been a lot of learning and a lot of mistakes as well. I mentioned before Tianqi's investment in lithium. Perhaps today, this week, lithium is very valuable, and they are happy that they invested. But until a few weeks or months ago, they were regretting very much acquiring that 24% stake because the company was not doing that well. And I'm sure that all those CEOs and executives are certainly using all that knowledge to replicate those lessons in different countries. But it's an iteration because by only replicating lessons, let's say in Chile, somewhere else in Peru, investments are always they always have troubles. They always fail. I find very interesting what in the previous workshop. And Eva Yao mentioned the Leuven workshops. Remember, I think not only regarding Benjamin's question, not only corporate approaches across countries are reproducing this local global engagement, but I'm seeing more and more other actors, educational institutions, universities. Tsinghua University opened a Latin American center in Chile, and I'm observing learning experiences from Latin America that could be used in other regions as well. And that's something interesting because we saw that non-corporate actors were also very much active in the mask diplomacy. So they are active actors which promote Chinese interests locally as well.
So you were referring to Neva Yao's paper. There's another paper in this series on Central
Yes,
Asia.
which is
That
great,
looked
by
at
the way.
vocational training. So we're past the top of the hour, so I'm very mindful of the time. But I got to ask one last thing, and then we'll just do like a lightning round. So if you each take 30 seconds. I have spent 25 years listening to people talk about the question of when China was going to converge with global models. In other words, what are they going to learn from international companies? What are they going to learn from international best practices? When are they going to import that and basically have global standards become Chinese standards? I'm just curious, given that Chinese players are operating globally, and as you all said, developing flexible local models. I just want to do a quick lightning round, 30 seconds each. Do you think there's anything that global players should observe and maybe even learn from what you see about Chinese local engagement that's worth adapting to and assimilating, or not, or gives a kind of a lesson not in best practices but not so best practices? And I'm looking at you, Cynthia, on that one. But let's just go quickly, kind of a 30 seconds each on that one. Taya, why don't you go first?
So I think one of the key takeaways, Evan, for me is this importance of patient capital in many ways. So across many of these different parts of the world, as I said, the business environment is difficult, the political environment is difficult as well. So one of the things that I think ties together all of the papers that we've looked at today is the fact that there's more patience in terms of trying and adapting to difficult operating conditions. And I think that's something that is important as we try and understand and learn from the Chinese experience of working in different parts of the world, because you're not going to, in most of these cases, you're not going to be able to make a quick buck. And if you do, then the long-term objectives of firms and of those particular countries as well are probably not going to sort of play out in the way that they do. So I think that's that for me, that the fact that there is an adaptation and there's a learning process, I think of this sort of a patient sort of a capital, as it's known in the literature, is extremely important.
Okay. Gong, you want to give a headline on that?
I think one of the takeaway is I feel, at least here in this region, I feel maybe I should say West, they somehow they don't understand what the local people really want. Of course, like human rights or labor rights, such issues should be heard, but here the local communities, they also want more tangible, measurable incentives, like what the Chinese projects can offer, like concrete job opportunities, a well-paved road to their villagers, a chain of infrastructure services like electricity and clean water. But the Western countries or the Western companies, they are either not interested, or they're incapable of mobilizing those resources just to achieve that. And the other thing is I think the Chinese government is very, very adaptive to what is happening in the local context, in the sense that they now try to balance different political leaders, unlike before. I think that's the takeaway from there.
Okay, Francisco.
I think that a very interesting takeaway from the mask diplomacy in Chile is that in less than 5 years, Chinese companies managed to build a strong network of connections, and they have worked very well in creating personal bonds between corporate people in China and corporate people in Chile, and to listening really and paying attention to local demands. So they are very open to ask what do you need, how can we help, and that was something that was very much appreciated, and which explains why China was such an important player in the mask diplomacy in this country. It was driven through the corporate sector.
Okay, and Cynthia, I'm going to give you the last word on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I got disconnected.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think what they should learn is much more pragmatism, right? Because Chinese are so much pragmatic, particularly within the Latin American region. They don't really mind whether they are like negotiating with a right-wing government or a left-wing government. I mean, at the end of the day, they are very pragmatic. And from the other side, I would say that another important lesson, and also looking at the previous dialogue that the Carnegie organized, is that when you have strong regulatory frameworks, you can sort of like negotiate or bargain with Chinese companies and the Chinese government in a very different way. And that is the sort of like the case of Brazil that they were mentioning in the last dialogue. I think that was one of the weak points for the Ecuadorian government in order to negotiate with the Chinese government and the Chinese mining companies. But I would say that pragmatism, which is something that the current Ecuadorian government is also using, because it is a right-wing government, but has been able to have, very strong cooperative ties either with the United States or with China, that has donated a lot of vaccines in terms of what Francisco was discussing, right? China has donated 700,000 vaccines for this government, compared to the previous government that was supposed to be more left wing, but was totally allied with the United States and didn't have like such a good relation with the Chinese government. So pragmatism, I think, something that is important for foreign policies within the regions, and in terms of other countries, how they see, that's what you were discussing, right? How Chinese see social corporate responsibility or human rights is very different from how the United States or the European Union see those topics.
Yeah, and I particularly like the point you made about bargaining power, because across all of these cases, that's the ultimate test of local engagement. If you, let's say you're a Chinese player and you want to bring a Chinese model, it's when you run up against the realities of local power, local agency, local influence, local norms and forms that you're compelled to adapt whether you want to or not. And then the variable becomes how adaptive is the Chinese player. And so, what I often say is, for a lot of these countries, particularly in the global south, the mathematical operations that matter are addition and multiplication. They're not subtraction and division, which means that for Western governments in particular that think the Chinese are going to be out of the picture, that to me is at minimum naive and at worst delusional, because there's a demand side pull for Chinese capital, Chinese presence, Chinese projects. But when the bargaining power is higher, when there's greater local agency, it does shape the ultimate outcomes, because Chinese players are actually more adaptive than conventional narratives often suggest they are. And that's, after all, in conclusion, why we have this project. We call it China Local Global, because China's a global player. Chinese is a global power, but local circumstances vary a lot. And so this question of how Chinese actors deal with local agency around the world is a very interesting one. And I particularly appreciate all you guys doing this, because it's nice to do it in a comparative context, in this case, across 3 regions. And we're going to continue to call on you to tell those stories and to work with us in other cross-regional contexts as well. I'm grateful to you guys. I'm grateful to the audience for sticking with us. I apologize. I know we ran over, but I hope you found it as interesting as we did. We actually have a website on the Carnegie website, China Local Global project site. And you can see not just the papers, but also multimedia packages with these and other authors. We do a lot, speaking of the local theme, in local languages. So Cynthia's paper is in English, but also in Spanish. Gong's paper is in English, but it's also, we're about to post it in Burmese, and so on and so forth. And the video packages are done with subtitles in local languages to keep with this theme of local outreach. So I encourage you all to go to the website, take a look. We're going to do more of these events. We've got 40 more of these papers coming from 7 regions. It's an exciting project, and I think it really captures the dynamism and variance and diversity of experience in the world today, including for China and for Chinese players. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to having you next time. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.